called a certification. It is a certificate of training because it's defined by one organization and has not been it has not followed that certification process. However, in our industry, if you're going to be an integrator, you should really have, I wouldn't say have to have, you should have that certificate of training, which requires a week of sitting in a classroom and then taking a test. It's all proprietary in nature, but there's value to that, right? What we're doing at ACP is establishing the industry's first non-proprietary ISO-aligned certification, which has been a multi-year, very expensive effort.
How you been, Brian? How's it going today?
Good, good. Are we live?
We are live. I like to just jump right on in there.
That's fine. That's fine with me. I'm good. How are you doing, Candace?
I'm doing really well. It's been a lot of fun with these podcasts, getting everything organized and producing them so everyone gets to see everything we're up to.
Good. Yeah, you're doing a great job with it. I've seen some of them, and the response to these podcasts have been outstanding.
That's awesome. Well, Brian, I hear more and more about the importance of acquiring industry recognized certifications. Can you provide more perspective on this?
Sure. So, well, let's just start back with the difference in the perception of what it is a certification and what isn't a certification. So, in the industry today, there are a lot of purportedly certifications. I think when people talk about getting certified, they always assume that they're getting certified under a, quote, certification. And that's just not the case. So let's start by talking about the difference between a certificate of training, or just a certificate, and a certification. A certificate is simply an indication that an individual has gone through some prescribed training of some sort. It could be, honestly, it could be anything. It could be you, for instance, teaching somebody the ins and outs of podcasting, and they complete the training regimen that you've laid out, and you then say you are certified or you have a certificate. But nobody ever says you have a certificate. They always use the term certification, which is the root cause of really the problem. A certification is something very different. A certification is something that is third-party accredited. In other words, a third party has looked at what you've done and they've accredited that as being or having followed a prescribed process of development. Certifications are much longer to develop. They require the input of industry experts across the board. So it can't be a Candace Haynes saying, these are the things that somebody needs to know to do podcasting.
For sure.
Right. If you were to do a certification for podcasting, what you would have to do is engage, first of all, subject matter experts in podcasting, which are representative of all the industry players or all the industry leaders in podcasting. You'd have to then create a chart of skills and duties that somebody would have to perform to be able to be an effective podcaster. And then you'd have to take that body of knowledge and, at a minimum, take that body of knowledge and send it out to the entire industry to get thousands of respondents and feedback about what you did right, about what you did wrong, about what needs to change. And that's just the first step. I won't belabor the point with all the subsequent steps required to develop a certification. But suffice it to say, it's significant enough for ISO, the International Organization of Standards, to have a complete standard, which is called 17024, which directs the guidelines or lays out the guidelines for developing a true certification. And so it's unfortunate that in the field, it's so difficult for people who are trying to come up in the professional ranks to sort out what certificates are really, the term is certifications, they use loosely, what certifications they need that have value really for any industry, and which are the ones that are strictly a proprietary definition of skill sets, which are, as we said, certificates, not certifications. And I'll just stop there to see if you have any more questions, because it is a common misunderstanding both in our automation industry and across the board in any technical field.
No, I think you explained that wonderfully, because if, that was a great example about the podcast. So referring back to the building automation industry, if I'm looking to increase and enhance my skills and, I'm not aware of the difference that you just made, that I am actually sitting for a certificate and not a certification, that's so important to know that difference. Because as you mentioned, the certification, the key point that I've gathered is that that's third party accredited. And you have these professionals that are reviewing the content that goes into that test. Whereas the certificate could be, like you said, I could write up a certificate and I could have, a couple people underneath me saying that, they have their skill set or their certificate came from Candace Haynes, and that's not going to be the industry, the podcast industry isn't going to recognize that. So I do understand. I see the difference. There's such a clear difference, but the words are so similar. It seems so easy to get that confused.
Yeah. And to continue on that thread for a moment, in our industry, there are the latter, I guess, as you describe it, the former is the Candace Haynes definition of podcasting. So let's pull on that thread for a minute. So in every industry, there's a company who sets out particular guidelines for training that are related to their equipment. And if their equipment is such that it's pervasive in the industry, let's use the example of Cisco certifications, which they call certifications. Cisco certifications are not certifications. They
Interesting.
probably sue me if they watch this podcast. So
probably.
But I've said this to Cisco and others, and I'll use another example. And their eyes widened, but when I explained it, they got what I was saying. It's a high value certificate. Cisco in the IT world is a very high value certificate, which everyone in the IT world should aspire to. But make no mistake, it is proprietary to Cisco. So not every certificate is going to have value like that, right? There are a whole slew of certificates in the IT industry which don't have really value as the Cisco certificate does. In our industry, for instance, I'm Niagara AX certified, which means that I went to training to become Niagara certified on tritium equipment, which is pervasive in our industry. That is, while it's called a certification, it is a certificate of training because it's defined by one organization and has not been, it has not followed that certification process. However, in our industry, if you're going to be an integrator, you should really have, I wouldn't say have to have, you should have that certificate of training, which requires a week of sitting in a classroom and then taking a test. It's all proprietary in nature, but there's value to that, right? What we're doing at ACP is establishing the industry's first non-proprietary ISO-aligned certification, which has been a multi-year, very expensive effort to achieve because of the reasons I mentioned previously.
So I'm already understanding some of those differences, as you mentioned, between the certificate and the certification. For individuals who are inquiring about this ACP certification or others like it, what questions can they ask to determine what they're investigating? Is it a certificate or a certification?
Yeah, that's very good. So there is, as we've mentioned, so much confusion about what's a certification. Everybody says they're certifications.
Mm-hmm.
There are very, very, very few certifications, right? For somebody to understand what is a certification and what's a certificate, a couple very quick questions they can ask. Number one, first and foremost, did it follow a process? Did it follow an ISO, the International Organization of Standards process? Is it accredited by ANSI, for instance, American National Standards Institute, or is it not? Right. That's probably the most pertinent question. Has a third party, which is a non-biased third party, by the way,
Mm-hmm.
because there can be biased third parties that can just look at it and say, hey, it's fine. But does it have that ANSI ISO alignment or not? That will not tell you for sure that it's not a certification, but it will give you a very clear indication. Number two, is it representative of an entire industry, or is it proprietary in nature? And what I mean by that is it delivered by, was it created by, and is it delivered by one organization which has proprietary interests or commercial interests? Nothing wrong with that. But if you're looking for a high value certification, it's not going to be delivered in that format. A certifying body is going to be either a nonprofit, which has a particular focus, such as ACP, or some other governmental organization which carries the burden of maintaining the question banks and the integrity of the question banks and the ongoing metrics you have to apply to the questions, if they're good questions or not. So an individual could also look at the organization who's offering that certificate or certification and see if it has proprietary interests or if it's representing a broader set of interests. And then finally, it's kind of related to that last point. How many organizations were involved? How many people have had eyes on this certificate, or who was involved in developing it? You know, with a certification, you can track the lineage once a certification is out about the individuals. Who exactly was involved? How many subject matter experts were engaged? Were they representative of the entire industry? Were they geographically represented? Or did they all come from one city? You know, with a certification, the answers to those questions are going to be very clear because they're dictated by the ISO guidelines that you have to have representation of large companies, small companies, industry sectors, geography, all across the board. That's why certifications are such high value and so expensive to pursue. But that is what ACP has done.
And Brian, those are some really good questions. You know, I think you made a good point. I think we stop sometimes when we're looking into things, we stop and look at the well-known company, their name, their presence in particular industries that we're looking at certifications, and we don't do our due diligence. Well, you don't know what you don't know. And so now we know, that it's important to look past the name of the organization, look past just that one that might be producing it or promoting it, to look and see deeper who else may be who may be a part of that particular certification or certificate, and then
That's right.
understand the difference between the two. So thank you for that. I think that is going to help a lot of people.
I'd like to add one more point to that.
Oh, yes.
I don't want to give the impression that there aren't high value certificates out there. There definitely are. I have a number of certificates in the industry, and as an educator and as an industry professional, I have a number of so-called certifications, which are mostly certificates, but they're high value and they're worthwhile. But if somebody really wants to get an understanding of maybe one that they're looking at that does not have that industry recognition, or it's not being asked at the interview table,
Yes.
you definitely want to understand the difference between a certification and a certificate.
I'm glad you said that too, because I was just thinking that it depends on the person's career path. It depends on where they are and their need. And so I'm glad you made that point that, all of the certificates and the certifications that are of high value, I think to
Correct.
your point, they, depending on your particular circumstances, they could all be beneficial. Just what you're wanting to communicate to listeners is that it's important to understand before
That's
you
right.
go ahead and move forward with it. So that's
Be informed. Yep.
be informed. Um, if I were a student or industry professional considering pursuing a certification, would you describe what are the benefits of pursuing a certification?
So if we're talking a true certification now, we're talking about something that's been vetted by an entire industry or a large sample size of an entire industry. So you likely have a result which is inherently high value because it's an industry speaking instead of one organization. But to me, the real value proposition is it clearly outlines the areas of competency that an individual has to demonstrate and show to become certified, to gain that certification. But so it has value in defining an individual's skill sets, not just to the individual about what they have to gain, but more importantly, or just as importantly, to an employer to understand what's the benchmark of training, what's the benchmark of skills, abilities, knowledge that this individual has. So if I'm an employer, which I have been in the automation industry for a long time, off and on, I would want to know more than just what's on somebody's resume, what they say they can do. I would really be interested in knowing what they've demonstrated they can do on a certification. And another important point of that for the value proposition for somebody who's pursuing a certification. Certifications also go beyond just the demonstration of skills on paper. There's something called a scheme for every certification. And a scheme is not something that sounds nefarious or whatever. It's not anything nefarious.
Mhm.
It is a full set of requirements of the individual which they must meet to be able to sit for the certification. So even prior to sitting for a certification, an individual must demonstrate that they've had the proper training either in the classroom or in the industry or a combination of both to be able to sit for the certification. And beyond that, it goes further into looking at their backgrounds. You know, every certification is going to have some benchmark of background. For instance, let's just talk about a criminal background. Some certifications will require that individuals not have a felony, or that they only have a certain class of felony, or that they only have a misdemeanor on their record to be able to sit. Or some may require that they don't have anything on their record. It depends on the scheme. The scheme also defines the reasons why an individual would be stripped of their certification. Maybe they've done something unethical or whatever. So my point here is that it gives an indication and a value, not just of the skills themselves, which are primary and front and center in nature, but it also gives a picture to the employer of the entire individual, because that individual has had to take the time and open up their background to a sufficient level to be able to qualify to sit for that certification. That scheme is also developed and refined over time by a group of subject matter experts. So every stage of a certification is being checked, balanced, reviewed, vetted. It's an ongoing process that never ends, which is what lends the value proposition to an individual for gaining a certification.
Going back to the scheme, that's interesting because I'm wondering, is there a way that before you want to sit for this test, what are things that you can do in order to make sure you demonstrate these schemes, and how do they check them off before the certification? Like, how do you present? I'm not sure what you would present before the certification. Like, what would that process be? I guess it's like a application you have to fill out.
Yeah, it's a complete package that you have to fill out and has to be reviewed and assessed, and then um, compared with the scheme document itself. So a
Oh,
scheme
okay,
is
I see.
yeah, the scheme is a set of prescribed and codified rules and regulations for the certification, and it is developed by, as I said, a panel of industry experts and who determine the background, the skills, the abilities, and all the things, the education, the number of years of education, et cetera, et cetera. Somebody has to demonstrate. So a scheme really is a set of rules. And if somebody were to apply, let's say, to become certified through ACP, they would have to present their educational background. They'd have to present
Okay.
their professional background. They'd have to provide a letter of reference. They'd have to open up themselves to a criminal background check. Some of those things they'd have to do. And to maintain the certification, there's a requirement for ongoing, as with most certifications, some ongoing continuing education. So if somebody were to prepare or a packet to sit for certification, they'd have to just check off all those items to meet the scheme requirements of ACP's certification, for instance. But every certification is going to have its own particular scheme, a set of rules and regulations which govern the certification, and which eliminate the subjectivity of any one individual saying, "Oh, well, we don't like this person for whatever reason.
Yes.
They can't sit for the certification." There can be none of that in a
Right. It's merit
certification.
based. Mm-hmm. And
Absolutely.
and I'm wondering, is that same process, selection process, if you will, is that the same for if you're just getting a certificate versus the certification?
Oh, well, I'll give you some examples of certificates that I've had in the past. I've had one I remember when I was young. I pursued a refrigerant handling um, so-called certification. It's really a
Oh,
certificate
no.
by the EPA. This one happens to be by the Environmental Protection Agency. It's called 608 certification, and anybody who handles refrigerants because they have an impact, or you more so used to have an impact on the ozone layer of the earth, would have to get this certificate, or this what they call certification. In that case, you could just walk into any training location that was offering training, and they would teach you almost exactly what was going to be on that test. I'm not trying to besmirch the quality or the value of it, but there was no demonstration of prior knowledge or training or industry exposure, none of that. You could just simply sit for the exam and take some training, sit for the exam. And so it's all over the place. I use that as just one example. It's all over the place with certificates because they don't follow those guidelines, right? So
Yes.
you could have some which are high value. The 608 is of high value. If you're going to work in the industry, you have to have it. Is it, it's defined by the EPA. So, I mean, there's no question that it's high value. You just have to have it. And there are certificates like that, but there are others out there that, I mean, you would have to question the value there, and the requirements to sit for and take those certificates they're just not governed by any third party. So they can be all over the map.
That's good to know. That's another big difference between the certificate and the certification process. Now, once we get this certification, what does it take to keep it?
That can also be all over the place, but in the certification world, again, there's typically going to be a requirement for ongoing education. And there are specific requirements for ACP for its technician certification, building automation systems technician certification. Those have not been shared yet. It's defined by the scheme committee in our announcement, which unfortunately has been impacted by the COVID crisis, which we're all experiencing. There will be guidelines that dictate the exact number of continuing education hours that you need to maintain your building automation technician certification. as guided by our scheme committee and scheme documents.
Thank you, Brian. I think I got a great overview of the advantages and the differences between a certificate and a certification, the advantages of taking a high value certification. We're going to take a break. We'll be right back. Okay, we are back. I got some more questions for you, Brian. ACP, we have been pursuing a certification for some time now. And
Right.
I was wondering if you can describe what kind of certification have we been pursuing?
Sure. Yeah. So years ago, ACP was founded with the goal of establishing the nation's first non-proprietary certification for the building automation systems industry. And that's not an easy thing to do, because if it was an easy thing to do, it would have been done a long time ago. In conversations with other organizations who have attempted to do this, they've run into all kinds of problems because the building automation systems industry is so disparate and divided as to the pathway that you might choose. So you might wind up being a systems integrator, for instance, or a programmer, or a field technician, or a salesman, or whatever. So it's a difficult challenge to put a stake in the sand and say, this is the set of knowledge, skills, and abilities that somebody needs to be able to be successful in this industry, in which you have so many, really an ecosystem of career pathways, right? So I've spent almost 30 years in the building automation industries, as I've had just about every role you can imagine, from a technician to an engineering supervisor to a systems integrator to a programmer, graphical user interface creator, you name it. And then having my own organization where you have to learn all the skills. So when I sold that company and I understood the need for programs in the Atlanta area anyways, I had a pretty good sense of all the different pathways somebody could pursue in automation. And we were able to establish a program, the nation's first program in awarding an associate's degree in building automation. And in that process, we were able to see where most of the students coming out of that program would gain first employment. And the area where most of them would gain first employment, almost 70% of the students, would be in the role of a field technician. Okay. So we took that as the benchmark, the highest and greatest need for a certification, because if we could cover that particular career pathway for individuals coming out of technical school or an apprenticeship, et cetera, then we could take the first step in setting that line of, hey, these are the skills needed to be a BAS field technician. And employers could understand, what it was or what it is that they're getting as far as skills. And then educational institutions could also understand the level at which they need to train to be able to prepare their students to sit for that certification in the BAS technician role. So ACP's, to summarize, ACP's certification is focused on building automation systems technicians. There are many skills required to be a building automation systems technician. And if someone were to prepare for that, or want to understand what it takes to prepare for that role, you could visit the ACP website, or you could, probably both, visit the ACP website, become a member, or just, view our guidelines, and then enroll in either a continuing education or a full degree program at one of our partner institutions, of which now what started with one institution in Atlanta are now over 100 institutions around the United States that are delivering some form or fashion of building automation systems education. ACP is helping them align their curriculum, which many already are aligned, some others are aligning now, to the guidelines of the ACP certification and the requirements needed of students to be able to sit for and pass, hopefully pass that certification. I know that was a long answer. I hope that addressed your initial question.
Yes, it addressed my second one as well, which I was ready to jump in and say, where? How can we prepare for this? It's great. They'll go to our website, and the rest of the information will be there, the step-by-step process. So I guess what I'm wondering next is, how can the BAS field technicians get training that may be needed for this ACP certification?
Yeah, so let's continue with that a little bit. The first step in establishing, I guess, flow of new talent into an industry like that really needs it, like building automation, is to establish programs of study or places where individuals in virtually any major urban center in the United States can go and get the training. Okay. There are online providers of training. I don't want to disparage anybody's approach to this, because I think there's a place for all of it. There are for-profit companies which are providing education for building automation training. They have a set of customers, and I think that's great. Our industry needs it. But for young people in particular, if we're going to address the shortfalls that this industry has in technicians, it can't be just a matter of upskilling in-field talent, which we already have in the industry and we're short of. It has to be an issue of bringing in new blood, new faces, and a lot of times those individuals don't have the resources to pay for private training or boot camp style training from for-profit institutions. So their only option is to go to a community or technical college or a university, all of which now have iterations of building automation systems training. And the reason for that is that provides the opportunity for financial aid up, for students who, or they may need to take a certain amount of student loans. But typically they can get the training that they need in 1 to 2 years at a community or technical college and come out hopefully with little to no debt, and get the training that they need and the support that they need from that institution. Now, ACP and the BEST Center, of which I've also been a co-principal investigator since its inception in 2012, provide resources to students for training, some guidance to colleges for aligning their curriculum. ACP even provides scholarship for students, as you're well aware, who are pursuing building automation systems education with the sponsorship of major companies and organizations. For instance, the Siemens Foundation is a big sponsor of that initiative. And so all of these resources are freely available to students. So we try to encourage students to go to community or technical college, choose a pathway. Maybe it's a condensed version, like a workforce continuing education condensed program where they can go in and get the training in 6 months and get out and get to work. Or maybe it's a full degree program that takes a longer period of time and matches the technical skills with the collegiate English and collegiate math, et cetera, et cetera. So they come out with a transferable associate's degree that they can later build upon for, higher level degrees. Whatever it is, I think we've created, or whatever the pathway is that makes most sense for that student, I think we've created very attractive and affordable ways for those individuals to get the training that they need in an institution which is probably, we've got the United States pretty well covered now, probably somewhat close to where they live, and for an affordable price. And so we try to route them to our community and technical and university partners to get that training in particular. But we would also let them know that as they proceed in their careers, there are a lot of other organizations which provide free resources who we've worked with, like the BACnet International, for instance, provides a lot of free training resources for students. The Best Center website provides a lot of resources for students. There are other private organizations that provide industry training. Locally in Atlanta, Stromquist is a big, great partner of ours, and they provide a great amount of training. Kelly Corporation provides a lot of technical bulletins and brochures, and has been very supportive as the nation's largest wholesaler in building automation for training for students. So there are a lot of answers to your question, which is why it's all over the place. But the central, I think, theme here is that community and technical colleges provide a very attractive means of gaining the training that somebody new or interested in the industry might need to sit for our certification.
Thank you for sharing all of those different resources. That's important for students to understand, that there are free opportunities out there for them to upskill and educate themselves in this area. Would you advise a student, particularly speaking on that audience, the younger audience, would you advise a student to go to these community technical colleges, and then upon receiving their building automation degree, would you advise them to immediately sit for the ACP certification once, of course, the ACP certification is out, or would you advise that they go immediately into the workforce and then sit for the certification, or does it just depend on the person?
Yeah, it would depend on a couple questions. Number one, if that institution is aligned to the guidelines which we've put out for ACP certification preparation, which many are now already, and the goal is for all of the institutions providing BAS education, or 99% of them at least, to align to the guidelines of the certificate. And I think they will. I mean, I have not come upon a college yet that's not interested in or has already aligned their curriculum to the research outcomes and to the guidance we provided, both through ACP and the Best Center. So if that's the case and the program is aligned to ACP guidelines, I would say the individual will be ready to sit for, and certainly qualified to sit for with their resume, if they have a degree in building automation or have completed a full program in building automation, to sit for and likely pass the certification. So in that case, I would say yes, immediately upon graduation, sit for the certification. Some states are going to be paying students to sit for that certification, and they will receive remuneration from, let me say this, they'll pay for the certification. They won't be paying the students directly.
Right.
They're paying for the certification.
I was like, let's
right?
clarify that.
Yeah, I misstated that. When I heard it again in my head, I'm like, wait a minute, no, it's not free money out here. But it
That's
is
a
free.
nice marketing tool, Brian.
So yeah, right. So it makes it easier. The states want to see their students certified.
Yes.
And they want to see them certified with a high value certification. And so that's the reason for that. And in fact, many states and their institutions are paid for the number of students beyond what they get from financial resources from the state and the federal government. They actually receive money because a student who has passed a certification demonstrates value in the program itself, which is being offered at the institution. So for instance, in the state of Florida, an institution which gets their students through the program, and then that student passes a certification, for every student who gets that last year, the college or technical school would receive $1,000. So there's a strong incentive for colleges to align to certifications and get their students certified. So that's the first part of the answer. The second part is this: if, for instance, a student, and I'll say this, ACP doesn't care where students get these skills. If a student has been in the field for a number of years, or let me not even say student, a professional gets their skills. If the professional gets their skills from being in the field, that's great. If a person gets their skills by teaching themselves, and can still meet the requirements of experience and or education for the scheme for ACP and can sit for the exam, ACP doesn't care. If a student gets it from a degree program, ACP doesn't care. At the end of the day, the only thing ACP and the certification is certifying is that that individual has the level of competency needed and can demonstrate that on the assessment exam, which is the certification exam. So let's say somebody who wants to become certified has never been to college and they've been in the field in the role of field technician for 3 years, for instance. They would be qualified to sit for and hopefully pass the certification. Now, do I think that it would be likely that they would have been exposed to all the bucket areas of competency that the certification is assessing? I would say no, because typically, from my experience as an employer and managing individuals, they may be highly competent in some areas, and in other areas, they may not, for whatever reason in their organization, it might not be part of their daily responsibilities. In that case, I would recommend that the individual during this ACP would recommend in the scheme review process, in looking at their resumes, you might consider getting some supplementary education in the area, let's say, of IT or the area of integration, or perhaps the area of sequences of operation, or energy management and energy management routines or sequences, which are all part of the exam, and many other areas are in the exam. So I would say for someone who's not been through a more formal process of education, it would be more tenuous, and my response would be more, it would be on a case-by-case basis about what they've done specifically in their professional experiences as to what other training or specific education they might need to be well prepared for the certification. So I hope that addresses your question.
That does. And so then I'm curious to know what would be the value for someone to sit for the specific ACP certification. We talked about, of course, the benefits of having a certification versus a certificate, but now more specifically with ACP, and you mentioned some of them earlier, but I just want to really make sure that everyone is clear the difference between the ACP certification. What will be the value to sit for that particular certification?
Yeah, so the ACP certification is very unique in that it is the first non-proprietary, ISO-aligned certification in our industry. It's taken a very long time to develop, a lot of money. A lot of folks have had their hands in it, and it really is an industry speaking about the common skills, knowledge, skills, and abilities, and attitudes even, that are required of for somebody to be an effective building automation systems technician. Okay. So the value proposition there is that it's just what I said. It's an industry saying these are the skills and the competencies we would like you to have, and like you to be able to demonstrate on the assessment exam, the certification, that you are competent in those areas, so that we can be confident as an employer that you have this set of abilities, this knowledge and abilities, etc. So that's the real value proposition. At the end of the day, the real question is, what do employers see as valuable as it comes to certificates or certifications, right? We've talked about the value of for systems integrators, of the Tritium Niagara certification. That's industry, is valuable in the industry. Another certificate that's valuable in our industry is Network Plus by CompTIA, just because it demonstrates a level of understanding of networking and lingo, methods, definitions, etc., that are commonly needed in our industry. We think that the ACP certification is going to be much broader in nature and much more requested, especially for new people coming into the industry, but also for those in the industry who want to advance their careers, because it's going to be asked for and requested at that moment of assessing a resume or an application, and it will ultimately make that resume or application look a lot more well-rounded. And I say that because this ACP certification is built on really 15 years of work in developing both at the collegiate level curriculum programs, disseminating best practices in those to a national audience. Now, as I mentioned, over 100 institutions around the United States. It's all supported by the National Science Foundation. We've done alignment and work with the Department of Energy. We have a basis for establishing the certification, which is very broad and deep. And then you overlay that with the involvement of virtually every building automation organization, their involvement in this through subject matter experts, through review, through guidance, and you have, at the end of the day, something that's very valuable and speaks to an entire career pathways needs as far as skill sets for individuals wanting to pursue a building automation systems technician career. That ultimately is the value of this certification to people who would consider pursuing it.
So, Brian, my last question for you. We went through some great information. We went through what the certification actually will be, the value, the benefit for the person and the employer. When are we going to announce that it is available, and where will people be able to sit for it?
If you knew how many times I got that question every week, it's one which I'm going to be very excited to provide an answer to very soon. We were planning, as you know, we were planning on this launch and release in the springtime. But we couldn't do that because the way that we've aligned the certification with our industry, with our collegiate partners, we want to provide a couple means. At the outset, we wanted to use testing centers, which are largely prevalent on college campuses, which now, as you know, are typically closed. So the stars did not align for us to already make this announcement of the release of a certification. We're monitoring the situation very closely and looking for a specific date to make that announcement to the public about where to go, about the certification itself. Number one, where do you go to get certified? And then, as we discussed earlier in our conversation, the way you prepare, what are the requirements to be able to sit for it, prepare for it, and then likely pass the certification. All this is moving with the decisions of our collegiate partners about their campuses being open, the testing centers being available. So we intend to have that announcement very soon and that date very soon, as it becomes in clear focus what the conditions will be in the fall for our partners around the country.
Well, Brian, I know you're going to be very excited and relieved to make that announcement.
Very much so.
I just want to thank you for giving us this valuable information about certifications in general, but specifically the ACP certification that will be coming out soon. And we'll have another podcast about that, I'm sure, in the future as well. Thanks, Brian, for coming on again, and I'll talk with you soon.
Thank you, Candace. I love being on these shows with you. You're doing a great job, and you're leading the way as far as our digital presence in building automation and STEM-related careers. And I say, keep doing what you're doing.
Thanks, Brian. Talk with you later.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.